Chapter 1. The Fallen Star. The jungle of EOS Seven was a living, breathing thing, a chaotic masterpiece of bioluminescent flora and alien wildlife that never truly slept. Massive, twisting trees loomed overhead, their thick canopies woven together like the ceiling of an ancient cathedral, blocking most of the sunlight from reaching the forest floor. The branches, covered in glowing vines that pulsed with a rhythmic blue-green light, hung low, casting flickering shadows that danced with each passing breeze. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the rich aroma of blooming flowers, some as large as a man's head, their petals curling and unfurling in hypnotic waves. Strange, iridescent insects buzzed and hummed through the air, their translucent wings catching the faint light like shards of glass. Ethan Calloway moved through this alien jungle with the quiet precision of a man who had learned long ago how to survive in places where most wouldn't last a day. He wasn't a scientist, nor was he an explorer by choice. He was an ex-soldier, a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and now found solace in the isolation of deep space planets where no one could find him. His ship, a patched-together transport named the Orion Solace, was docked at a clearing a few miles back, hidden beneath a thick canopy to keep it from being detected by any passing satellites. Not that there were many of those on EOS 7. The planet was classified as uninhabitable for large-scale colonization, meaning only small research teams or illegal smugglers had any real reason to be here. Ethan was neither. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. Dressed in reinforced jungle gear, his weathered leather jacket draped over his shoulders despite the humidity, Ethan carried his rifle slung over his back, a modified LZ-49 plasma repeater, something he had sworn he would never need again. And yet, in places like these, one didn't stay alive without being prepared. His rugged, unshaven face bore the lines of a man who had lived through things he didn't talk about. His dark brown eyes scanned the dense vegetation ahead as he stepped carefully over a network of roots, his boots pressing softly into the damp soil. His destination was a crash site. An hour ago, the sky had split open with a streak of fire, a massive, blazing object tearing through the atmosphere at an unnatural speed. It had hit somewhere deep within the jungle, shaking the ground with the force of the impact, sending shockwaves that rustled the trees and scattered the wildlife. Ethan had seen ships crash before: pirates, rogue surveyors, the occasional fool who thought he could chart a new trade route through restricted sectors, but something about this one was different. There had been no distress signal, no automated emergency beacon, nothing. Just a silent fall from the heavens, as if whatever had come down had done so deliberately. And so, Ethan went to investigate. His breath was slow and steady as he moved forward, his hand brushing aside a hanging vine that curled slightly at his touch, its bioluminescent tendrils retracting as though offended. The closer he got to the impact site, the more he could feel it, an odd, almost electric charge in the air, a pressure that prickled against his skin like the moment before a thunderstorm. The jungle here was eerily silent, the usual distant calls of creatures now absent, as if the very presence of the crash had driven them away. Then, through the dense foliage, he saw it. The crater was massive, at least 50 feet across, the jungle floor scorched black, where something not of this world had torn through the atmosphere and slammed into the earth. Smoke and steam still rose from the smoldering metal at the center, the unmistakable wreckage of a spacecraft. Not a human one. Ethan knew Earth-made ships well enough to recognize that this was something else entirely. The hull was sleek, almost organic, with smooth, silver-like plating that reflected the surrounding jungle as if it were alive. Jagged fractures ran along its length, and strange, glowing blue veins pulsed faintly across its surface, as though the ship itself had once been a living thing. But it wasn't the ship that caught Ethan's attention. It was her. Lying just beyond the wreckage, half buried beneath fallen debris, was a woman, or at least, something close to one. She had skin that shimmered faintly beneath the jungle light, a soft lavender hue that deepened to a more vibrant purple near her exposed arms and shoulders. Her hair, a cascade of silver and deep indigo strands, was spread around her like a halo, shifting slightly as though it had a life of its own. Her delicate facial features were sharp yet elegant, her lips slightly parted as she lay unconscious, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She was hurt. Ethan was moving before he even thought about it, his instincts overriding any hesitation. He slid down the edge of the crater, his boots kicking up loose soil as he approached her. He could see the damage now. Her right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken beneath the torn fabric of what looked like an intricately woven bodysuit, now burned and slashed from the crash. A gash along her forehead dripped a thin, silver-like blood, the color shimmering faintly as it caught the light. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her injuries. He had no idea who she was, what she was, or if she was even friendly, but none of that mattered right now. She was dying, and he wasn't about to let that happen. "Hey," he said, his voice low, calm, the same voice he had used on countless wounded soldiers in the past. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Her breathing was too shallow, her body too still. Ethan swore under his breath, his mind racing through options. He wasn't a medic, but he knew field medicine, and a broken leg like this needed immediate attention. Normally, he would set the bone and splint it, but her biology was completely unknown to him. Would she even heal the same way? Would human medicine work on her? He didn't have time to wonder. Glancing around, he found what he needed: a long, straight branch, sturdy enough to serve as a splint. He tore a strip of fabric from his own sleeve, then retrieved a small injector from his belt, a painkiller, human-made, but hopefully enough to keep her from waking up mid-procedure. "All right, princess," he muttered as he pressed the injector against her uninjured leg, the device hissing as it administered the drug. "This is going to hurt like hell." With practiced movements, he set the bone, the sickening pop making his stomach tighten. She stirred, a faint whimper escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. He quickly wrapped the makeshift splint around her leg, securing it tightly, his hands moving with an efficiency that came from years of tending to battlefield injuries. He exhaled, sitting back on his heels. She would live, but the real question remained: who was she? And why was she here? As Ethan studied her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, and that whatever had brought her crashing down to this world wasn't finished yet. The jungle canopy loomed overhead, swaying gently as a warm breeze drifted through the thick foliage. The bioluminescent flora that covered the forest floor pulsed with an eerie rhythm, as if reacting to the presence of the unconscious alien woman in Ethan's arms. She was still breathing, but the rise and fall of her chest was shallow, her pulse weak. Whatever strange physiology kept her alive was holding, but barely. The silver-like blood that seeped from the cut on her forehead glistened under the faint glow of the plants around them. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in. He had found a living alien woman, a princess for all he knew, crashed in the middle of an uncharted jungle. The implications alone were staggering. If she belonged to a galactic empire, then whoever had sent her down here wouldn't be far behind. He adjusted his grip on her, carefully avoiding her injured leg as he stood. He had secured the splint, but it was only a temporary fix. She needed better treatment, rest, hydration, and possibly even advanced medical intervention that he couldn't provide. The question wasn't just who she was, but why she had come here, and why no one had followed. If she had been shot down, then it meant she had enemies. And if she had enemies, then Ethan had just put himself in the middle of a fight that was far bigger than he wanted to be part of. But she had been alone, vulnerable, and dying. He couldn't just leave her there. With careful steps, Ethan started his trek back toward camp, the weight of her limp body warm against his chest. His boots pressed into the damp earth, leaving deep imprints in the moss-covered ground as he navigated the twisting roots and thick foliage. Every now and then, he would glance down at her face, searching for any sign of wakefulness, but she remained unconscious, lost somewhere between life and death. The trip back to his camp took nearly an hour. By the time he reached the clearing where his makeshift shelter stood, the twin moons of EOS Seven had risen high above the treetops, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. His cabin, built from the remains of his old ship and reinforced with metal plating scavenged from nearby crash sites, stood in quiet defiance against the wild surroundings. It wasn't much, but it was home. He stepped inside, the metal door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. The interior was simple: a cot, a workbench littered with half-disassembled tech, a set of old military rations stacked in the corner, and a central console that provided power to the small outpost he had created. It was isolated, hidden, and secure. Ethan laid the alien woman down on the cot, adjusting her position carefully so that her injured leg was supported. She stirred slightly, her lips parting as if she were trying to say something, but no words came. Instead, she winced, her body tensing for a moment before falling still again. Ethan crouched beside her, reaching for a damp cloth to clean the wound on her forehead. The silver blood had stopped flowing, but the skin beneath was still split, the edges of the wound slightly glowing, a strange effect that he had never seen before. Was it an effect of her biology? Did her species have accelerated healing? He wiped away the dried blood carefully, his touch light. "Who the hell are you?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Ethan exhaled sharply, sitting back. This wasn't just some lost traveler or scavenger. Whoever she was, she had come down in a ship that wasn't built by human hands. That meant she was important. And if she was important, then people would come looking for her. He just didn't know whether they'd be friends or enemies. Outside, the jungle was quiet. The usual night sounds muted as if the planet itself knew that something unnatural had arrived. Ethan had lived here long enough to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him that trouble was on its way. But until then, he had a princess to keep alive. Chapter 2. The Awakening. The first thing she felt was warmth. A deep, encompassing warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing the aches in her body. The second thing she felt was pain. A sharp, throbbing agony radiated from her right leg, sending pulses of discomfort through her entire body. She tried to move, but a heavy weight held her down, forcing her back into the softness beneath her. She gasped, her eyes flying open. The room was dimly lit, filled with strange objects and unfamiliar technology. Metal walls, a single viewport revealing the dark jungle outside, the faint glow of bioluminescent plants casting ghostly shadows across the space. It was a shelter, crude but functional, filled with the scent of oil, metal, and something distinctly human. Then, she saw him. The man sat across from her, watching her carefully, his dark brown eyes unreadable beneath furrowed brows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined with years of hardship, but not unkind. He had the look of someone who had seen war, someone who had lived through things that left scars not only on the body but on the soul. She flinched, her body tensing instinctively, but the sudden movement sent a bolt of pain through her leg. She cried out, her breath hitching, and the man was on his feet in an instant. "Easy," he said, his voice rough but calm. "Don't move too much. You broke your leg. I said it, but you need rest." She blinked, her mind sluggish, the words slow to process. A broken leg? Yes, she remembered now. The crash, the fire, the impact. Her eyes darted around the room again, searching for her comms device, for anything that could tell her where she was, but nothing familiar met her gaze. The man noticed. "Your ship is gone," he said bluntly. "Crashed. No distress signal." He crossed his arms. "You're lucky I found you." She swallowed, her throat dry. Her voice, when it finally came, was weak. "Where am I?" He studied her for a moment before answering. "My camp. Middle of nowhere." She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. "How long have I been unconscious?" "A few hours." That was bad. Her mind raced. If she had been unconscious that long, then it meant her pursuers had a head start. If they had been tracking her descent, they could already be on their way. She needed to move. Needed to get out of here before. "Don't even think about it," the man said, as if reading her mind. "You're in no condition to run. You move that leg wrong, and you'll be in even worse shape." She gritted her teeth, her frustration rising. "I don't have time to stay here." He raised an eyebrow. "Then you better start talking. Because if someone is coming for you, I need to know whether I should be waiting for a rescue or getting ready for a fight." She hesitated. Then, finally, she looked him in the eye and spoke the truth. "My name is Alara Velthau," she said softly, "and I am the heir to the Valari Empire. If they find me, we'll both be dead." Ethan exhaled. So much for a quiet life. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable, his dark brown eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her throat dry. He didn't move, didn't speak for several seconds, and Alara could almost hear his mind working, processing what she had just told him. An alien princess, the heir to an empire, hunted, injured, stranded on a hostile planet. That was a lot for a man like him to take in. Alara had been trained in diplomacy, in reading people, in understanding how different species processed information. She could see it in the tension of his jaw, in the way his hands curled slightly at his sides. He didn't doubt her, not entirely, But he wasn't sure whether to trust her either. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "I think I misheard you. Did you just say your royalty?" Ilera winced as she tried to sit up further, her leg burning with pain. "Yes," he scoffed, shaking his head. "And let me guess, the people chasing you? They aren't exactly coming to roll out a red carpet." She swallowed hard. "No, they want me dead." Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Of course they do." She didn't have the patience to let him come to terms with it on his own. Every second they wasted was another second closer to being found. "Listen to me," she said, her voice firm despite her weakness. "If they find me here, they won't just take me. They'll kill you too." That made him pause. His eyes flickered with something, not fear, not quite, but a hardened realization. She could tell by the way his shoulders squared that he had dealt with danger before. He wasn't panicked, but he was now calculating, considering what this meant for him. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because you helped me," she said. "That's enough." Ethan exhaled sharply, turning away for a moment. He paced near the small workbench, where scattered mechanical parts lay next to an old rifle, the only sign that this man had once lived a life beyond isolation. He wasn't the type to let things go, not his past, not his burdens, and certainly not a problem like her. When he finally turned back to face her, she saw something shift in his expression. Not fear, not anger. Resolve. "All right, princess," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Tell me who's coming." Chapter 3. The Hunt Begins. Ilera inhaled slowly, bracing herself against the dull ache in her leg. She had no choice but to trust him now. Whether he was a soldier, a deserter, or simply a man looking to be left alone, he was the only chance she had. "The ones hunting me are called the Zelvari Dominion, an elite faction loyal to my uncle." She paused, watching his reaction, but he gave none. "He staged a coup against my family, assassinated my father, and seized the imperial throne. I barely escaped the palace. My ship was meant to take me to an allied world, but I was intercepted before I could leave the system." Ethan crossed his arms. "So they shot you down?" Ilera shook her head, her silver-white hair falling over her shoulders. "They tried. I managed to override my ship's navigation system and force a warp jump before they could destroy me. But it was unstable. I had no control over where I would land. I ended up here." Ethan let out a low whistle. "And now your uncle's goons are tracking you." She nodded, feeling exhaustion creep into her limbs again. "They will find me soon." Ethan didn't speak right away. Instead, he walked to the viewport, peering out at the dense jungle beyond. The moonlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the ground. He seemed to be thinking, weighing his options. Then, without turning, he asked, "How many are we talking about?" Ilera's stomach twisted. "A hunter-killer squad, most likely." Ethan let out a slow breath. "How many in a squad?" 8 to 10 soldiers. Highly trained. Ethan turned back to her, his expression grim. "And we're supposed to fight them off with what? A broken leg and an old rifle?" Ilera clenched her fists, frustrated at her own weakness. "I wouldn't have dragged you into this if I had a choice." He studied her for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he crouched down beside her. "Look," he said, his tone softer now, "I get it. You didn't ask to crash land in my backyard. And I sure as hell didn't ask to be involved in an intergalactic war. But here we are." Ilera met his gaze, unsure what to say. Ethan glanced at her injured leg. "You'll need at least a day before you can walk on that. Which means if they find us before then, we're screwed." Ilera gritted her teeth. "I'll fight, broken leg or not." Ethan actually smirked at that, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'm starting to believe you would." Then, he stood, moving toward his workbench. "But let's not make that our first plan, huh?" She watched as he pulled out a compact device, something that looked like a modified beacon. "What is that?" she asked. "A decoy," he replied. "We can't stop them from tracking your ship's crash site, but we can make sure they find something else first." She blinked, impressed despite herself. "You're planning to mislead them?" Ethan shrugged. "If we can make them think you went in the opposite direction, we buy time. Maybe enough to get you out of here before they realize the truth." Ilera felt a flicker of hope. "That could work." He grinned. "It will work. But first, I need to know, can you handle a weapon?" Ilera's eyes narrowed. "I was trained since childhood." Ethan chuckled. "Of course you were." He tossed her a small plasma pistol, a lightweight but powerful model. "Here, just in case plan A fails." Ilera caught it, the weight comforting in her hands, familiar. She had been running for so long, fleeing, hiding, but now, With this man at her side, she felt like she could fight again. Ethan secured the decoy device, adjusting the settings before standing up. "All right, princess. We've got work to do." As he stepped toward the door, Elara felt something strange, a warmth in her chest, a sense of trust she hadn't felt in years. She had lost everything. Her home, her family, her throne. But maybe, just maybe, she had found an ally. And that was the first step toward taking it all back. The jungle was alive with movement, the sounds of distant creatures echoing through the thick canopy. The soft glow of bioluminescent fungi pulsed beneath the tangled roots, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the forest floor. Ethan and Elara moved quickly, carefully navigating through the dense foliage as the decoy beacon in Ethan's hand blinked in rhythmic intervals. They weren't just running, they were setting a trap. Elara's injury limited her speed, but Ethan adapted, supporting her when needed and making sure she didn't fall behind. She was determined, pushing through the pain without complaint. Her expression hardened into something that reminded him of soldiers he had fought alongside in the past. There was no doubt in his mind she was trained for war. As they moved, Ethan explained the plan. "We plant this decoy about a mile east of the crash site. It'll send out false energy readings. Make it look like you went that way instead of here." Elara nodded. "That will buy us some time, but it won't fool them forever." "Doesn't need to," Ethan replied. "Just long enough to figure out what we're up against." They stopped near a shallow ravine, where Ethan crouched and began activating the beacon. Elara leaned against a tree, catching her breath, her injured leg trembling slightly beneath her weight. Ethan stole a glance at her, noticing the way her fingers tightened around the plasma pistol he had given her. She was prepared to fight, but exhaustion was catching up with her. "How bad is the pain?" he asked. Elara exhaled, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "Manageable." Ethan smirked. "That's the kind of lie I used to tell my CO before I passed out from blood loss." She actually chuckled at that, shaking her head. "Fine. It's worse than I'd like to admit. But I'll survive. Good enough for me." Ethan finished adjusting the decoy and activated it. A high-pitched hum vibrated through the air before fading into a steady, barely noticeable pulse. "That should do it." Elara glanced around, suddenly tense. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Elara's violet eyes narrowed. "They're here." Ethan stilled, listening. At first, there was only the soft rustling of leaves, the distant hum of alien wildlife. But then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of approaching boots. He grabbed Elara's arm. "Move." They slipped back into the underbrush, moving as silently as possible. The plan was simple: observe first, engage only if necessary. Ethan had no doubt that Elara could handle herself, but in her current condition, fighting would be a last resort. They reached a rocky ledge overlooking a clearing, just in time to see the enemy arrive. A squad of Zelvari Dominion soldiers emerged from the jungle, their black armor blending into the shadows. They moved with deadly precision, weapons drawn, their visors glowing a deep crimson. Ethan counted 8. Elara tensed beside him. They sent their best. Ethan didn't doubt it. These weren't just mercenaries or common foot soldiers, these were hunters, trained to track and eliminate high-value targets. And right now, Elara was the highest value target in the galaxy. One of the soldiers knelt, scanning the ground with a sleek, wrist-mounted device. A red holographic projection flickered into the air, showing a heat trail the path Elara had taken from the crash site. Ethan cursed under his breath. "They're tracking residual heat signatures." Elara clenched her jaw. "Then we have less time than we thought." The squad leader gestured toward the decoy's location, and half the team broke off in that direction. The others stayed behind, scanning the area with their weapons raised. Ethan watched them closely. If the decoy worked, they'd be led away from this area, giving him and Elara a chance to retreat. But if they figured out the deception too soon, they'd be caught between highly trained killers with nowhere to run. Elara's breathing was steady, but her grip on the plasma pistol had tightened. She was ready to fight if it came to that. Ethan glanced at her and whispered, "Let's move." Slowly, they crept back, keeping low, using the dense jungle foliage as cover. Every step was carefully placed, avoiding branches and leaves that could give away their position. They needed to get back to the cabin, regroup, and come up with a new plan. Then, behind them, a branch snapped. Elara's eyes widened. One of the soldiers turned sharply toward their position. Ethan had no time to think. Run. Chapter 4. The Broken and the Mended. They burst from the foliage, Ethan gripping Illyra's arm as they sprinted toward the only safety they had, his cabin. The jungle came alive with plasma fire, streaks of red cutting through the darkness as the Zelvari soldiers pursued them. Ethan fired over his shoulder, not aiming to kill, just to slow them down. Illyra fired as well, her plasma bolts more precise, striking one soldier in the leg and sending him crashing into the undergrowth. They reached the clearing just as Ethan's security system activated automated sentry turrets, salvaged from a derelict warship, whirred to life, and opened fire, forcing the enemy squad into cover. Ethan didn't slow. He threw open the metal door and shoved Illyra inside before diving in after her. The heavy door slammed shut, the reinforced locks engaging just as another volley of plasma fire struck the outside walls. They collapsed against the floor, panting. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan let out a ragged laugh, shaking his head. "I really know how to pick my house guests." Illyra groaned, rolling onto her side. "I think I may have pushed my leg too much." Ethan sat up immediately, his concern overriding any sarcasm. He moved to her side, carefully unfastening the makeshift splint to check her injury. The skin around the break was swollen, but the wound was healing. Ethan froze. "What the hell?" Illyra winced, but managed a weak smile. "Nanite enhanced biology. My species regenerates faster than humans. But it's not instant. I still need rest." Ethan let out a slow breath. "You could have mentioned that earlier." She chuckled softly. "You didn't ask." Outside, the sentry turrets continued firing in intervals. The Zelvari soldiers were trying to break through, but Ethan's defenses would hold for now. Illyra watched him, her expression softer than before. "You saved me," she said quietly. "You could have left me there." Ethan glanced at her, shaking his head. "Not how I'm wired." Silence settled between them. Illyra shifted slightly, her violet eyes meeting his. "Why do you live out here?" Ethan hesitated. The past wasn't something he talked about. But then, after a moment, he sighed. "Lost someone. Couldn't deal with it. So I left." Illyra studied him, as if seeing beyond the soldier, beyond the recluse, into the man underneath. "You can't run forever," she said softly. Ethan smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, well, maybe it's time I stopped trying." Illyra reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. A silent promise. A connection. Outside, the Zelvari continued their assault. Inside, something else was beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Calloway didn't feel alone. The cabin shuddered as another round of plasma fire struck its reinforced exterior, the metallic walls groaning under the relentless assault. The automated sentry turrets outside fired in steady intervals, keeping the Zelvari soldiers at bay, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last forever. These men were trained hunters, and once they regrouped, they'd find a way through. Illyra sat on the floor beside him, her breath coming in soft, measured inhales, her regeneration working slowly but effectively. The swelling around her leg had already reduced, and the nanites in her bloodstream had sealed the fracture, knitting bone and tissue together at an accelerated pace. But she was still exhausted, still vulnerable. Ethan reached for his rifle and checked the energy cell. "Half charge." He grimaced. "We're running out of time." Illyra forced herself to sit up, wincing slightly but determined. "We can't stay here. If we wait, they'll breach the cabin." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing through the possibilities. Their ship was destroyed. They had no immediate way off-world. And if the Zelvari Dominion had already located Illyra here, then it was only a matter of time before they sent reinforcements. They couldn't fight forever. Illyra's fingers curled around the plasma pistol he had given her earlier. "There's one way out of this." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." She hesitated for half a second before speaking. "My ship's emergency beacon is damaged, but not beyond repair. If we can activate it, there's a chance my people will detect the signal and send reinforcements." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "A chance? I don't love those odds. They're better than staying here and dying." He sighed. She wasn't wrong. Pushing himself to his feet, he crossed the small room to a storage crate, yanking it open and pulling out an old satellite transceiver he had salvaged months ago. "I might be able to boost the signal," he muttered, his fingers already moving to pry open its control panel. "If I can patch it to whatever's left of your beacon, we could get a distress call out." Illyra nodded. "Where's the beacon?" "In the wreckage," Ethan said grimly. "Which is about half a mile from here." Illyra clenched her jaw. "Then we go." Ethan stared at her, surprised at the sheer determination in her eyes. She had crashed, nearly died, broken her leg, been hunted across a jungle, and she was still ready to fight. He shook his head, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. You don't give up, do you? Illyra's gaze was steady. I can't afford to. Neither could he. The final escape. They moved quickly. Ethan took the lead, keeping his rifle raised, scanning every shadow as they slipped through the dense jungle. The Zelvari had spread out, their formation looser now, their focus still on breaching the cabin, which worked in their favor. Illyra limped slightly, but the pain had dulled, and her strength was returning with each passing minute. She was no damsel in distress. She matched Ethan's pace, her plasma pistol steady in her grip, her eyes sharp, calculating. The wreckage was ahead, the crumpled remains of her ship scattered across the scorched clearing where it had crash-landed. The emergency beacon lay half-buried beneath the wreckage, sparking intermittently. Ethan hurried forward, kneeling beside it, flipping open the transceiver and working quickly to splice the two systems together. He could feel Illyra watching their surroundings, her posture tense, waiting for the inevitable. You sure your people will pick this up? Ethan asked as he reconfigured the beacon's power relay. Illyra inhaled sharply. I don't know, but I have to believe they will. The seconds ticked by. Then a pulse of energy shot through the jungle. The beacon came to life, its core flickering erratically before stabilizing into a steady rhythm. A signal, weak but clear, burst outward into the void of space. Ethan exhaled. Now we wait. Illyra wasn't convinced. They won't let us. She was right. The Zelvari had found them. A voice echoed through the clearing. End of the line, princess. Ethan turned to see 6 soldiers emerging from the trees, their weapons raised. They were led by a tall figure in midnight black armor, his visor pulsing red. A Zelvari commander. Illyra's grip tightened around her pistol. Varos. The commander tilted his head slightly. You're good at running. But this is where it ends. Ethan slowly raised his rifle. Yeah? Funny. I was just about to say the same thing. The first shot was his. Plasma fire lit up the night. Illyra dropped low, firing with precision, her bolts striking true. Ethan moved with fluid efficiency, dropping 2 soldiers before they could react. The fight was brutal, fast. Too fast. Ethan dodged behind the wreckage as a plasma bolt nicked his shoulder, the burn searing through his jacket. Illyra gritted her teeth through the pain in her leg, shifting her stance and landing a shot to the chest of one of her pursuers. But Varos was faster. He lunged at Illyra, striking with a blade that hummed with energy. She barely dodged in time, the weapon grazing her side, sending a jolt of pain through her body. Ethan didn't hesitate. He tackled the commander, the impact sending them both sprawling to the ground. Varos was strong, trained, ruthless. Ethan had fought men like him before, but this time, he wasn't fighting for himself. Illyra, despite the pain, took the shot. The plasma bolt struck Varos in the back, sending him collapsing forward, his armor sparking violently. Silence followed. The remaining Zelvari, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Then, a sound filled the air. A thunderous boom. Ships. Sleek, silver-blue vessels descended from the sky, their engines humming with power. Illyra's people had arrived. The Zelvari turned, realizing too late that they had lost. Within seconds, they were surrounded, forced into submission by the superior forces that landed in swift formation. Ethan exhaled, lowering his weapon. About damn time. Illyra swayed slightly, exhaustion overtaking her. Ethan was beside her in an instant, steadying her before she could fall. She looked up at him, a mix of gratitude and something deeper in her violet eyes. You saved me. Ethan smirked. I told you I don't know how to walk away. Illyra's lips parted slightly, and in that moment, she knew. She had spent so long running, fighting, surviving. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. As her people approached, she held Ethan's gaze. You could come with me, she said softly. Ethan hesitated. His whole life, he had been running from something: his past, his pain, the ghosts of the people he had lost. But with Illyra, it felt different. Maybe, for once, it was time to stop running. He exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. You really think a scrappy mechanic like me belongs in a royal court? Illyra smirked. I think you belong wherever you choose to be. Ethan glanced at the jungle around him, at the place that had once been his escape. Then he looked back at her, and he made his choice. All right, princess, let's go save your empire. As the ships lifted off, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Ethan realized something: his heart wasn't as broken as he thought. And maybe, just maybe, Alara was the one who had fixed it.